The Nordic school model is based on inclusivity and equal access to quality education, regardless of background or circumstances. The COVID pandemic has challenged these principles and forced teachers, students, and parents to adapt to new systems for teaching. What have we in the Nordic region learned from this experience? And what can we learn from each other as we now finally move forward? Dear friends, on behalf of the Research Center of Excellence, QUINT, Quality in Nordic Teaching, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this, yet again, hybrid seminar on Nordic schools during COVID-19. Those of us present are here in the House of Literature in Oslo, Norway. Most of you are out there online. But wherever you are, thank you all for joining this event. My name is Monica Bjermeland, and I'll be your host today. Soon we will hear from distinguished guests from across the Nordic region who will discuss the impact that COVID has had on schools in their country. But first, I'm excited to let Paula Lehtomäki, the Secretary General of the Nordic Council of Ministers, open this truly Nordic event with some brief words on its context. Paula?
Dear Nordic friends, I welcome you all to discuss the future of Norden, to discuss the well-being of our children and these 2 years of the pandemic. Thank you for the opportunity to open this event. The Nordic region will be the most sustainable and integrated region in the world by 2030. This is the vision for the Nordic cooperation. The goal of our leading politicians is also that our region is the best place in the world for children and young people. In this work, schools play a very, very important part. Schools are central for the well-being of our children and a cornerstone in the development of the Nordic societies. Our Nordic societies are built on the very idea that everyone has the right to be included and should be given the opportunity to prosper. Therefore, we need to take extraordinarily good care of our schools, even under difficult circumstances such as a pandemic. We are not over the pandemic yet, but we have learned a great deal already. The Nordic countries have handled the pandemic differently. It is of great value to us as an integrated region to investigate which effects the different measures have had on children's and young people's physical and mental health, as well as their social lives. We now have excellent possibilities to conduct high-level research to the benefit of our citizens. Nordic institutions under the Nordic Council of Ministers, such as Nordforsk and Nordic Welfare Center, are actively working on exploring this field of knowledge. And today, you have the opportunity to learn more about what this entails. The last 2 years have been difficult. For some, the virus has been fatal. For others, the measures taken have had severe consequences. Particularly vulnerable children and young people have suffered during the lockdowns. But there have been also many success stories. The Nordic countries managed to adapt to a digital daily life in almost a blink of an eye. This readiness for change is in challenging times is important. This is something to promote and remember. Our ambitions for the well-being of our children and young people are high. And so we need to learn from our efforts and expand our knowledge to avoid creating a gap between our ambitions and the actual results of our endeavors. It is ever more important that we strengthen our joint efforts and safeguard the possibility for a bright future for every single child and young person in our societies. Dear friends, I am impressed by how schools, teachers and students in the Nordic countries have managed during the last 2 years. But there is always room for improvement and opportunities to learn from each other. I find it very encouraging that this initiative today has brought together so many relevant stakeholders to discuss these important topics. It is essential that we share the results from the research and our joint deliberations so we can make sure that next time we are hit by a crisis, we can do even better. I wish you all an interesting webinar.
Thank you so much for those wise words, Paula. We now turn to the first part of our two-part program, where we will hear short presentations by researchers from Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, and Norway, who have studied the impact of COVID-19 on the education system in their respective countries. If any of you out there online have questions for the presenters or for the panelists coming up in part 2, please write them in the chat function, and we'll try to include them in the Q&A section later. Our first presenter is Professor Ane Kvottrup from the University of Southern Denmark, who will tell us about her research on the long-term consequences of COVID-19 on students' well-being and values. Ane.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting us for this seminar. I think it's a very important way to discuss the consequences of COVID-19. Thank you also for the opportunity to present me and my colleagues' work today. My name is Ane Kvottrup, and I'm a professor at the University of Southern Denmark, and also the project leader of a Danish large-scale study of COVID-19 related consequences for schools and students in Denmark. What I present today are an analysis based on data collected longitudinally over almost 2 years, since April 2020 and until December 2021. And we will follow the students 1 more year with a total of so far 5 data collections. The project includes both qualitative and quantitative data from students, parents, teachers, and school leaders. In my presentation today, I focus on the latest data collection from the December 2021 to provide an updated picture of the situation with students in Denmark. The background for carrying out this longitudinal study is based on previous studies on contemporary school closures due to pandemics, societal crises, or environmental hazards, which suggest that such situation may compromise students' well-being and affect their development. On the other hand, the background is studies that describe the situation as a natural experiment, where contextual conditions make it difficult to generalize from previous studies. Thus, there is a need for systematic data collection, so as not to risk that the handling of the situation is based on stereotypes and anecdotal evidence. In my presentation today, I refer to theories suggesting that we often have too narrow concepts of well-being. As well as feeling satisfied and happy, well-being means developing as a person, being fulfilled, making a contribution to the community. Based on this, I distinguish between 3 types of well-being: emotional well-being, referring to general feelings of joy and happiness; social well-being, referring to being able to enter into and sustain successful relationship with others; and academic well-being, referring to the feeling of being able to functionally adapt in school and being motivated for classes and for learning new things. Furthermore, I refer to the stress framework described by Shankar and colleagues, who describe how students may be affected by stresses or excessive adversity early in life. I focus on how students' well-being changed during 2 years of repeated school closures and reopenings due to COVID-19, and want to discuss how these changes risk affecting the Nordic vision of lifelong learning. This figure shows the general picture of students' well-being during the 2-year period in Denmark. The well-being is measured on a scale from 1 to 5, and as can be seen, the Danish students over the period have been between 3.5 and 4 when it comes to social well-being, between 3 and 3.5 when it comes to emotional well-being, and slightly lower between 2.5 and 3 when it comes to academic well-being. Thus, it seems that students have had a fine level of well-being all the way through the pandemic, And in this regard, the study does not find evidence for any of the violent consequences mentioned in previous studies. However, we get a more nuanced picture if we dive a little deeper into the data. In this slide, the level of well-being as it appears in the latest data collection from December 2021 is differentiated in relation to age. This makes it clear that the oldest students are somewhat more challenged than the youngest are, and that they are especially challenged on their academic well-being. That is, their joy of learning and their commitment to school. Furthermore, as indicated in this slide, we also identify a number of possible COVID-19 related stressors to be aware of. As can be seen, many of the students are still in Denmark in December 2021, afraid of getting sick and of family friends getting sick. At the same time, it is clearly indicated in our qualitative data that the very high infection rates that we have experienced since December 2021 and still experience lead to stressful situations with a high degree of uncertainty. As the teacher in the quote here says, students never know which adult is coming, and we never know whether we have between 4 or 27 students. So we are dealing with an everyday life that is just really unpredictable. This calls, I think, for an examination of whether there are students who are more affected than others. We have done this by conducting a cluster analysis across the 3 well-being dimensions and the stress factors. I suggest that we need to pay special attention to the students in cluster 1, which makes up almost 25% of the students in the December 2021 sample. These students have a fairly high level of stress and are challenged on the different types of well-being, emotional, social, and academic well-being. If we define vulnerability as being at risk of reduced educational commitment and poor educational outcomes, this group of students are, I think, vulnerable. They're low in academic well-being and the joy of learning, and they do not seem to have social relationships in school that can balance their well-being. Therefore, it is reasonable to assume that they are challenged on the sense of commitment to school. There are more girls than boys in cluster 1, and there is a predominance of older rather than younger students in the cluster. Apart from these characteristics, the analysis do not provide a basis for saying which students fall into cluster 1. Teacher data from the project, however, indicate that it may be different types of students. Asked who has had a particular difficult time during the period, they point to different types of students. They point to special class students, students with reading, writing difficulties, students with socially challenged home, students with parents in jobs that are critical to society, which means that they have been sitting alone for a long time, students and students with other ethnic backgrounds than Danish. Thus, they are not necessarily students that teachers are used to identifying as vulnerable. This makes the designation of risk factors, as we do in this study, extremely important. Teachers need some clues to support the important work in helping students on the other side of the pandemic in order to not risking that these students actually become vulnerable and have poor educational outcome and reduced educational commitment. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Anne, for reminding us of these vulnerabilities. We now move to our second presentation. Anna Slotte, lecturer at the University of Helsinki, and Professor Marie Nilsbert of Karlstad University in Sweden. They will present their findings on the shift to online schooling and teachers' readiness for this transition. Over to you, Anna and Maria.
Yes, thank you. I will start this presentation. In this study, Classrooms Going Online, Nordic Lower Secondary Teachers' Readiness at the COVID-19 outbreak, we focus on the teachers' experiences from the very first period of the pandemic in terms of readiness. The study is a collaboration between researchers from 4 Nordic countries, and you can see the names on the slide, from Denmark, Finland, Iceland, and Sweden. And we have done this study within the project of Connected Classroom Nordic, that is a part of QUINT. Change slides. We made a joint planning because we didn't know if we should become sick and so that we could keep going, have a common plan if a supply teacher would step in or if we would have to fill in for each other. We had an in-service training day when we should both learn Teams with all that involves, and then during the afternoon, plan all lessons. So I must say that when I went home and almost cried that day because my head was full, like a giant football. These words from one of the Swedish teachers in the study is an example of how teachers in the Nordic countries faced challenges that were difficult to overview at that time. We know now that the different countries took some different measures in the situation, but in common for all, at the time of the outbreak, was a state of uncertainty. What would happen and how were they going to cope and manage these new situations? We think that there are lessons to be learned by listening to the teachers at the initial phase of the pandemic, which we have done in this study. Within the project, we conducted 17 interviews with teachers from the 4 different countries, and they were teaching different subjects. As the project follows so-called digitally rich schools, all of the interviewed teachers already had experiences of working with digital resources and platforms. However, the new situation with short notice demanded new thinking and new ways to work with digital tools for remote teaching. We were interested in what challenges and strategies the teachers described when they talked about their experiences from the initial phase, and also how they described the role of digital technology in these processes. And our analysis resulted in 3 main themes.
And I will continue. The first theme is about organization of teaching. With short notice, schools had to make decisions about how to organize teaching in relation to time and place. And in some of the schools, the timetable for students were made shorter. In others, teaching followed the ordinary schedule. Some of the teachers emphasized the importance of trying to keep the lessons as normal as possible, meaning that each teacher was responsible for the class during the regular schedule, even if the situation was totally new for everybody. I have, since we began, actually tried not to make any major changes more than necessary, both for the students' sake and my own, because quite quickly the work team got a lot of feedback about what worked or not in the system. And I was surprised at first when I got a lot of praise, and the only thing I did was to keep on as usual. This was my magic trick. From many of the teachers' voices, we can see that the prioritized goal was to maintain some kind of everyday normality, which indicates the importance of the social dimension of the school. The second theme concerns classroom dialogue. Even if teachers had access and competence to use digital technology in new ways, they all found online communication insufficient. Through almost all interviews, teachers pointed out how dependent they were, their ordinary teaching was on face-to-face interaction, including the possibility to read the class, and in that sense be able to support students when needed. It's really hard to teach social science online. As a teacher, you are always monitoring students' progress to see if they understand. I look at them a lot, making eye contact, and I talk with my hands when explaining something. Yes, I use my body a lot when teaching. The third and last theme relates to assessment of student learning. Yes, namely the whole effect, we know nothing about it. I know they have written a newspaper article that shows that they know something about layout and structure, etc., But in reality, it only shows if they have been able to read an assignment. Assessing student learning in education today includes both formative feedback practices in the classroom and summative grading of students' performances. As the teacher could not see and communicate with the students face-to-face in the remote teaching, they didn't really know how the students received the teaching. However, the teachers also told about creativity in their ways of using tests digitally.
So, to sum up, these voices from our interview study show how the teachers managed the situation as best as they could, drawing on their professional competence. We find that good digital conditions created opportunities for them to quickly change teaching so that students' everyday schoolwork could be maintained in a good enough way. But what is perhaps even more important is the individual and independent readiness that the teachers showed when they dealt with the crisis that had arisen. They showed professional autonomy in a difficult situation. They did not only wait for orders from above, but took their own initiatives to find solutions. Therefore, we suggest that an important conclusion, both from our studies, is that judicious and independent teachers, given the space to act, is not just a matter of professional interest. It also is a question of having societal readiness for new unexpected crises that may arise in the future and that we now cannot fully overcome. So, thank you.
Normality has certainly become more fluid. Thank you, Anna and Maria. Our next presenters will share some findings from Iceland. How has the pandemic impacted teaching quality in the volcano island? And what has been the experience of Icelandic teachers during the pandemic? Professor Hermína Gunnþórsdóttir from the University of Akureyri and lecturer Berglind Gísladóttir from the University of Iceland. Over to you.
Yes, hello. Thank you for inviting us. It's a really interesting moment. I will start. I'm Hermína and Berglind will take over. We will start with a very short introduction to the study, but it was conducted in Iceland in April 2020 during the first wave of the pandemic. And we conducted semi-structured interviews with 13 teachers, 8 classroom teachers, and 5 special education teachers who were employed in 3 Icelandic compulsory schools, 2 in the capital area and 1 in an urban area. And the aim of the study was to explore effect the changed practices during COVID-19 had on teachers' professional collaboration and teaching quality. So that was on our interest. And the questions that guided the interviews were grouped in these 6 categories, and they were all pre-tested with 2 teachers. So it's well-being and support, teaching and working environment, responsibility and duties, the future, and other issues. And then straight to the findings, we present them in the paper in 4 sub-chapters. And if we start with the focus on core subjects, we see that emphasis was placed on core subjects, while all other subjects were mostly ignored in these 3 schools. Some teachers directed the teaching of Icelandic to the families of students so they could further utilize the time in school for mathematics. And the teachers said that lesson planning was hardly used. The academic demands were clearly lowered, according to the teachers. And they said that in the beginning of the situation, they really tried to hold up the academic requirements, but that very soon changed. And since a large part of the students' learning took place at home or online, teachers found it difficult to understand what the basis of the assessment should be. And because they did not have kind of data in hand, they did not feel they had sufficient overview of students' work, and therefore they found it problematic to conduct a high-level assessment. And then to the second two categories, professional work and collaboration. In some cases, teachers felt that their professionalism had been limited by the COVID restrictions. As you see from the quotes of one teacher, he felt that he was put in a box instead of staying in a flow. But some of the teachers mentioned the opposite, felt that they had more freedom to be creative and do what they actually wanted to do. But despite major changes in teachers' working conditions and teachers working remotely from home, their teachers all experienced increased and more focused collaboration with their colleagues. Then the last theme on uncertainty and insecurity. The teachers all believed that the situation created by COVID-19 had affected their mental well-being in some way. They all put on a brave face, as they said, but they said that they had experienced powerlessness, restlessness, uncertainty, a little fear, restraint, and chaos. And then I will hand control over to Bjermeland.
Thank you. Yes, there was a clear shift from academic demands to students' well-being. And by doing so, teachers prioritized what they thought was most important for students and set aside one of the main aims of education, the academic requirements. We relate this discussion to teachers' professionalism, and by doing so, there are three central obligations. There are care, skills, and knowledge, and teachers mainly focused on care, essentially placing forward what they thought was most important. Prioritizing safety and well-being before academic demands, kind of ensuring Maslow before Bloom. These new challenges, obviously these are really new situations that all teachers in Iceland found themselves in, and teachers around the world. And what we found was interesting, there was an increased focus on collaboration with peers, even though there was less academic demands. So there was a kind of controversial therein. Despite that, despite challenges, students were able to adapt to these challenges, and some of the teachers found that the students were very resilient. They were like impressed that they were able to flourish when they were not spoon-fed the material, really. So when they were giving more leeway, and their imagination and creativity got blossomed, but so they were able to do amazing things, as one of the teachers stated. Can you go to the next one? Thank you. But teachers were also experiencing a lot of insecurities, and we found insecurities related to three things. To the virus itself, they were worried that they were going to catch the virus and get sick, and they were worried for themselves and their families. Obviously, even though teachers were deemed as central workers, they really would not prioritize when it came to vaccinations. So they were worried about getting contracting the virus itself, and worry for themselves and their families. And then worry for the teaching. They didn't know really what to emphasize. There was no clear instructions from the ministry. They didn't know how to focus, and some were faced with some limited time with students, so they didn't know how to conduct assessments. So that kind of insecurities. And thirdly, and most important, they were very worried for the students' mental health and well-being. In crisis situation, there were limited guidance on best practice, and the insecurities of teachers were kind of based on that. They didn't really know what they were doing, basically, or felt that they didn't know what they were doing. Can you go to the next one? So, what do we learn from all of this? This study contributes to the understanding of teachers' experience and how they make decisions in their classrooms. What are they emphasizing, really? It also gives valuable information regarding what teachers prioritize when it comes to their students' education and well-being. So we're not all used to teaching in situations like this, and this study kind of tells us what do teachers prioritize above all other things, and that is students' well-being. We also found interesting contrast in the data. We saw that there was increased collaboration between teachers, essentially strengthening the learning communities within their schools, even though there was less focus on academic demands. Some teachers found new and creative ways. They found they could step a little bit outside the box and were innovative when it came to digital solutions. Others found it challenging. Some found it eye-opening that they could have more academic, demand more of students thinking. Wow, I color blocked out there. They could demand that students were more independent in their learning, and that they could do amazing things if given the chance. Yes, so it changed practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Increased collaboration and resilience. That is good news. Thank you so much, Hermina and Berglind. Our final presentation in part 1 is by Professor Marte Blikstad Ballas of the University of Oslo, who is present here at the House of Literature. Marte is going to tell us how individualized homeschooling in Norway has challenged the Nordic model of equitable education. I'm happy to say that the floor is yours, Marte.
Thank you, Monica. I'm very happy to be here. And as you said, I will be talking about how individualized homeschooling could be at odds with the equity ambitions in the Nordic model of education, which is a very dramatic title, but it has also been a very dramatic time. So the starting point for our work has been what is the Nordic school? What kind of ideals do we have? And as has been mentioned by several of the speakers already, equity, equality, equal opportunities, and education for all, regardless of, for example, parents' educational background and socioeconomical status, are key principles within the Nordic model of education. And the school system is considered within the Nordic model to be the single most important way to safeguard these principles in order to promote citizenship, inclusion, democracy, and lifelong learning, regardless of who your parents are, for example. So if we put this very, very simply, because we have a limited amount of time, we could say that a key idea in the Nordic model is that we take all these different students from different homes and we bring them together in the same school. Now, what does the pandemic do? The pandemic puts us in kind of the opposite situation. So it really challenges the Nordic model, is our hypothesis, because what we do with a pandemic situation is homeschooling, where we take all the different students within the same school and send them back to their very different homes. And we wanted to investigate in our study, how does that impact what it is to be a student and how different parents perceive the schooling and the education that their children are getting. So we addressed to what degree and how the key ideals of equality and equity for all students were challenged in the period of homeschooling in the spring of 2020 in Norway. And we have a study that we will be giving some highlights from today. And normally we are classroom researchers, so we would ideally like to be very close to each student and see how they do school. But during the pandemic, that has, of course, been impossible. So we have done a survey with 4,642 different parents with children in grades 1 to 10 in the Norwegian educational system. And we have asked them about how they experienced the period with homeschooling. And we had both closed items where we asked them specific questions, but also open-ended questions where we asked them to write in their own words how they experienced this very difficult for many times. And so we focus on what a typical day of remote teaching was for both parents and children. And we focus on main challenges and benefits. So our hypothesis was that parents with lower educational background would perhaps report more challenges with the homeschool situation, because those are the children and the parents that are usually placed in the so-called vulnerable group of students. So we expected to find more concerns and more negative experiences in that particular group. So we will see how that went. One of the things that we find very, very important to say, and I hope this will also be a key premise in the debate we will have later today, is that we cannot really talk about homeschooling as one thing, because what we see very, very clearly in our data set is that there is great variation in what kind of education and support students actually got from their school. So we know that different schools on different grade levels did very different things. We also know that different teachers within the same schools may have done very different things. So the mandate of what it is to be a teacher during the pandemic was perhaps a bit unclear. At least we see that different teachers did different things. And one thing we know is that we have good reasons to see that all teachers did the best they could within the very difficult situation. But we have found that there are 3 factors that mainly influence how parents report that they experienced the period with homeschooling. And so these 3 findings are our key findings today. And the first one is that we know that parents' level of education matters. And as I said, we expected that the parents, to put it simply, the higher the educational background, the easier it would be to deal with homeschooling. We actually found the opposite, which is a bit surprising, but we did find that parents with lower educational background reported more success and more positive things about homeschooling, and there might be several reasons for that. One of them is that the expectations might differ between the groups, but also we see that these parents had less home office situation and less competition between their job and tutoring their child, which plays a major role in homeschooling if the homeschooling relies on a lot of individual tasks, which we know that it did in Norway. We also see, so the parents' level of education and their work situations go together. And if you have a parent that is at home and able to help you, that was a major benefit for students. And we think it's important to document that and discuss it. We also see that the students' access to equipment matters. And Norway is known to have great digital infrastructure, and we do. So this is not the case for many students, but for the around 1 or 2% that did not have good enough access, that was a very, very big problem during homeschool. So we think this is are very interesting findings, and we hope they will also nuance who are the vulnerable students during the pandemic, because our study shows that what matters the most is to have a person that can help you with your schoolwork regardless of their educational background. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Always engaging to hear you present. Thank you all for these 4 interesting presentations. I think we're beginning to get a picture now of how the pandemic has affected teachers, students, and parents in the Nordic countries. In the next section, we will hear from some key voices in the political area in these countries about the national measures to keep education running during the pandemic. And while we set things up here in Oslo, we will take a short break. Part 2 begins in 5 minutes. See you then. Super. Welcome back. We now begin part 2 of our program. Here on stage with me is Steffen Handal, President of the Union of Education Norway, and Elin Brandsæter, Principal of Fagerborg Lower Secondary School in Oslo. Welcome to you both. Joining us online, we have Gunilla Svantorp, MP and Speaker for the Education Committee in Sweden, Ragnar Thor Petursson, President of the Icelandic Teachers Union, and Guri Melby, MP and leader of the Liberal Party in Norway, unfortunately from her house, ill with COVID. She was Minister of Education in Norway from 2020 to October 2021. Welcome to you all, and especially to you, Guri. We will also have a short video presentation by Pernille Rosenkrantz-Theil, the Danish Minister of Children and Education. To lead the discussion with our very distinguished panel of guests, I would now like to introduce Professor Kirsti Klette from the University of Oslo, who is the reason why we're all here. Kirsti has had a long career as an education researcher, having observed hundreds of classrooms over the decades. Today, she is the director of the QUINT Research Center and one of the co-editors of a new special issue on the Nordic experience during COVID-19 in the journal Education in the North, the base on which this seminar stands. I know she has plenty of great questions prepared for the panel. Over to you, Kirsti.
So thank you, Monica, for this nice introduction. We'll start this panel debate with a video presentation, as Monica mentioned, kindly sent us from Minister Pernille Rosenkrantz-Theil in Denmark. She could not participate herself today, but we are truly grateful she can share her perspectives with us through this video. So Pernille, vær så god.
Jeg hedder Pernille Rosenkrantz-Theil, og jeg er børne- og undervisningsminister i Danmark. Og jeg vil forsøge at gøre det bedste, jeg kan i forhold til at forklare og samle op på, hvordan vi har gjort det i Danmark under corona. Altså lærerstanden omdannede sig hen over en weekend fra at gennemføre fysisk undervisning på den måde, vi altid har kendt, og så til allerede fra mandagen at gennemføre online-undervisning. Og det er klart, at kvaliteten af online-undervisning i den første nedlukning var lavere, end den blev senere hen. Men fjernundervisning blev en ryggrad i hverdagen for børnene under nedlukning, allerede under den første nedlukning. Det var rigtig, rigtig godt gået. Så der er ikke nogen tvivl om, at det at miste klasselokalet for eleverne, jamen det har selvfølgelig rigtig store både sociale og indlæringsmæssige omkostninger for nogle af eleverne. Men jeg synes, det lykkes helt fra start af, faktisk fra dag 1 af den første nedlukning, at få skabt en lærerstyret hverdag, kan man sige, omkring børnene. I den første nedlukning var det fuldstændig tydeligt for os, at en af de meget store forskelle, det var alder. Altså at det var i sagens natur meget nemmere at undervise elever, der var 13, 14, 15 år gamle, end det var at have med de helt små at gøre, hvor de er 6, 7, 8 år gamle. Det blev tydeligt inden for de første få dage, så det var meget tydeligt for os, at der måtte der ligge en meget stor forskel i, hvad man fik ud af det. Og derfor traf vi allerede i forbindelse med den første nedlukning en beslutning om, at de første, der skulle tilbage i skole, det var de små. Så selvom at der selvfølgelig har været et hensyn til de elever, der skulle til eksamen, så blev det vigtigste at sige, at der skal være et udbytte af undervisningen. Og der, hvor det er sværest, og hvor det samtidig er sværest at få struktur på hverdagen, det handler altså om alder, og det vil sige, at de små skal tilbage først. Og det har vi faktisk holdt fast i igennem også de næste nedlukninger. Og der var et af de allerstørste fokuspunkter i anden nedlukning, som var meget længere end den første nedlukning. Det var de socialt udfordrede elever. Og der vidste vi fra første nedlukning, at lige så snart man siger ordet nedlukning, så holder folk deres børn hjemme. Men vi ved jo godt, at der er en del af eleverne, hvor det at være lukket inde, hvis man for eksempel har 2 forældre, der er alkoholikere, og har et meget konfliktfyldt hjem, så er det jo rædselsfuldt at være lukket inde derhjemme under en coronanedlukning, og også nogle virkelig vanskelige betingelser for, at der foregår nogle former for indlæring. Og derfor var vi i anden bølge af nedlukning ekstremt fokuseret på, at hver eneste gang vi sagde nedlukning, så sagde vi, men ikke for den gruppe af elever, hvor der er indlæringsmæssige eller sociale udfordringer. Der må man fortsætte i skolen på normale vilkår, hvor man dukker op fysisk. I foråret 21, der var det så også åbenlyst i den her anden bølge, at der havde vi været lukket ned så længe, at det ville sætte sig som relativt store konsekvenser både indlæringsmæssigt og socialt for en gruppe elever, og derfor valgte vi at sætte lige knap 1 milliard danske kroner af til både trivselsindsats i forhold til elever, hvor vi ved, at det har været svært, og så for at få samlet op på de eventuelle faglige huller, der var opstået på ryggen af corona. Så valgte vi i øvrigt, og det gør vi ikke med let hjerte, men vi valgte at aflyse både test og afgangsprøver og eksamener i meget vid udstrækning, og dermed give eleverne et helt andet grundlag for at tage deres eksamener end under normale omstændigheder. Så i forhold til den tredje nedlukning, der har den faktisk været utrolig anderledes end første og anden nedlukning. Vi synes ellers nu, at vi har fået utrolig godt styr på det, og vidst nogenlunde, hvad er rutinerne omkring nedlukninger. Og det, der så bare viser her i tredje bølge, det har været, at det ikke i så høj grad har været den samfundsmæssige nedlukning af skolerne, der har været udfordring. Det har faktisk i høj grad været, at smitten har været så høj, at der har været rigtig mange lærere, der ikke har været, altså de har jo simpelthen været sygemeldte, eller været isoleret, fordi de har været nære kontakter, eller der har været rigtig mange elever, der har været fraværende af samme grund. Så det har været en ekstremt urolig periode her omkring tredje bølge, og der har været rigtig meget aflyst undervisning som resultat af det. Og der har vi så skulle ind og træffe beslutninger om, at man ikke skal give erstatningstimer for den aflyste undervisning. Altså fordi så vil man jo simpelthen skubbe en pukkel foran sig med timer, som skal afvikles inden sommerferien. Det kan simpelthen ikke lade sig gøre. Der er ikke lærerkræfter til det, og der er ikke ork til det i sektoren. Trods al den uro, der har været, så har der faktisk været en meget høj grad af ro på skolesektoren i Danmark undervejs i coronatiden. Og der er altså en del af erfaringerne fra det, som vi har taget med direkte videre ind i vores daglige måde at arbejde på her på bagkant af corona. Så udover at vi selvfølgelig kan lære rigtig meget om skoledrift, i form af, hvad er det fjernundervisningen kan, og hvad er det også, den ikke kan, så har vi altså også fået rigtig meget ud af det i forhold til den samarbejdsform, der er i vores demokrati, og hvor at vi efter min mening har lagt mange alen til, hvad det betyder at drive en skolesektor i fællesskab med hinanden, med interessenterne på den ene side, og med Folketingets partier på den anden side, og også som regering selvfølgelig. Og det har været enormt givetigt, og måske den vigtigste lære at tage med for corona. Tak for ordet.
Thank you. Now we turn back to the panel debate, and as we argued, 2 of them will be online, will be situated here in Oslo, and 3 will be online. So Stefan and Elin will be here in the Literature House, while Guri, Gunilla and Ragnar will attend to the online resources. So we will switch a little bit back and forth. You have to excuse us for this. And also I would like to underscore once more that you have the opportunity to put questions through the chat during the whole session, both to the participants presenting results before in the first session, as well as to the panelists. So in this first question I pose to you, I'll actually want to have a reply for all 5 of you. And that I'll start with those present here in Oslo. And the big question is, how would you summarize lessons learned from this first period of COVID schooling? I'll start with you, Stefan.
Thank you so much, and it's a huge question. With I could go on for hours about this, but let me start off by saying it's been a lot of work, and it's been a period of uncertainty. It's been a period of unpredictability. And I think also it's taught us that education and teaching is really best at school. I think everybody can agree on that. Teaching and learning is a social process. It's not an individual project for a student and one teacher. And I think the social element of education and teaching has been, well, it's been obvious for everybody during this period. So that's one lesson. I think it's tempting to call myself Captain Obvious when I say but children learn in very different ways. And I think that's been very obvious through this pandemic. And some kids have actually found this period quite challenging, but others have found it to be quite nice, actually. And I think we should really be more concerned with finding out how we can address the individual element in the social setting. I think that's a really important lesson for us. I think it's also quite obvious that teachers have shown a tremendous capacity to adapt, and that includes also the students. We can just take our hats off for everybody and say, wow, it's unbelievable that we made it through this, even though it's not finished yet. I think it's also quite true to say that in the Norwegian and probably in a Nordic setting as well, we've found that the trust that we have in our societies have really been one of the main and biggest resources for us to get through this pandemic. And I think the collaboration between local governments, central governments, the unions, I think it's been one of the most important things to keep schools and kindergartens open as much as we've been able to in Norway. One of the things that I keep asking myself is that through this pandemic, we've been it's been talked a lot about the vulnerable kids. I don't like that expression. I think all kids are vulnerable, but we understand what we mean when we talk about that. And I keep going back to this. Is it true that schools in a normal situation actually hide the fact that society does not really give these kids what they actually need? And when school closed down, it was quite obvious to everybody that there's something lacking here. But in a normal situation, teachers alone cannot give all these kids all the different things that they need. And I think that's probably a very important lesson for us going forward. I could go on, but maybe somebody else will.
Yeah, and you have more chances later on. So, Elin, from the perspectives of a school leader, how would you summarize this?
I agree with Stefan on a lot of things. First, I would like to say that the headline of pandemic schooling is unpredictable. And I'm really happy that I didn't know in March 2020 how long it would last. Because all the hasty preparations we made in that 24 hours before we had to close down, that's weird to think about now. And the most important thing is that I'm really amazed to have witnessed how adaptable the teachers have been and also the students from day one. I'm really impressed by the teachers' ability to show creativity under such conditions. The great effort and will they have had to reach every student every day, because there was a demand in Oslo that they should have contact with each student every day. And they did so, and they also tried as best as they could to maintain high quality, which is almost impossible in a digital teaching world. As well as Stefan, I have been really concerned about the social distance and isolation according to mental health, vulnerable kids. At first, school was totally closed down, so we had no kids at school. But when we started up again and red level and closed with teaching offered to the vulnerable kids, they showed up and got the most luxury student situation ever, as Stefan addresses. They had very many teachers for few students, and the quality of their teaching and learning situation was higher, much higher than we normally are able to. The ones who concerns me the most are the vulnerable kids who didn't show up at school even if they were allowed to, because they didn't dare to show the differentness. They wanted to stay home to be normal under conditions that were really concerning. That's the most severe thing about that situation. And third, the reminder to all of us how important the social community at school is, and the interaction between social and academic learning, how important that is, and really, really necessary thing to get good results for everyone. That was a reminder this period.
Can I turn to Iceland and the teachers' union leader Ragnarur and ask for his perspectives on this general question?
Yes, thank you very much. I of course agree with my colleagues there, and we have quite a few ways to answer this question. I'm sitting here in Iceland in isolation with my COVID-sick son, and that would not have happened 2 years ago. So there have been changes. Some are superficial, but some are somewhat deeper. And this has been a very, very demanding trial, teaching us that in the end the education system is here to meet the needs of children, but not for children to adapt to. So this is a big reminder of that. I think that what we have learned, if I can focus it into one point, is this: that everyone in dark times, everyone will do their best, but there is a huge difference between the best we can do on our own and the best we can do together. And this we have had. This has shown a lot of strengths, but also quite a lot of weaknesses that we have in our system. And I think that the context that we use when trying to draw learning from this 2-year period, and however long it will be, is we have to put it into context. And what I am particularly interested in is that here in Iceland, which is a very homogenic society, very, very simple society in many terms, I have fears on the tendency to polarize our community and fracturize our community. Our community has been ever more polarized in the last 2 years. This was not when everyone was afraid and everyone was just trying to stay alive during the pandemic, but as we went on, society started to divide, and there's been a difference in the tone in how we speak to each other and how we go about things. And this, I think, is a serious matter, and there are many dangers for our education system if we do not draw the right conclusions from this and try to mend that a society lacking the common base is a society that has great trouble running the school system. And for instance, I can't imagine the possibility that we would have schools that were open only for children that we classify as sensitive or somehow underprivileged children. I can't imagine that we would never call those children to school and make them identifiable as a certain group of our society. And I wanted to keep that way. I wanted to be an unthinkable situation. But I have seen that the COVID epidemic has been a catalyst in dividing the Icelandic society. There's been an attack on science and on truth, a global attack that has reached us, and attacks on truth and science in the end is an attack on education. So we can put our learning into many contexts. Some of them have to do with teaching techniques and online learning, but others are elemental questions about the makings of society. And I particularly like the presentation from Norway, which addressed this. So I think we should take that very seriously. Thank you.
Thank you. Could we move to Sweden and Gunilla from the Education Committee in the Swedish Parliament?
Yes, thank you very much. It has been 2 difficult years for us as well. We have had, as you know, the most of the schools open because we thought the school is not only important for the students' learning and the future, but also for the health and the well-being in everyday life. The government has commissioned the National Agency for Education to investigate the pandemic's consequences for education in the school system, because we see that we have a lot of teachers who were sick, and we have a lot of pupils who were sick. So we have to look at that. It will be finalized in December 22, but a partial report came in December 21, and it shows us that despite the fact that the access to education student participation has been good most of the time, there is a risk of a loss of knowledge. And also the teachers' opportunities to grade have been affected. National tests have also been cancelled during these years. And a somewhat high absence, as I said, of both students and teachers, and also teachers' high workload, of course, and distance education when the spread of infection was high have affected the results. And especially within Swedish for immigrants, the loss of knowledge is judged to be more severe. And we also see that many children were also less prepared when they were to start preschool class in 21. But there are also many principals who judge that there has not been a loss of knowledge. So there is partly different images. But I will say that, of course, it has been a big challenge, despite the fact that we have had our schools open, of course. And all teachers have been fantastic during this hard work, I will say.
Thank you. And now we turn back to Norway, and actually our Minister of Education during this first period, Guri Melby.
Thank you, and I'm very happy to be a part of this seminar, even though I'm also at home with COVID. And I first want to say that the description that the Minister of Education from Denmark gave of the situation is also a description that fits the situation in Norway, I think. How the different waves affected us, what kind of priorities we did during those waves. For instance, that we prioritized the smallest, the youngest children going back to school, but also some of the youths in vocational training, for instance. I have said many times during this period that we shouldn't exaggerate the negative consequences of the pandemic, but we shouldn't minimize them either. And I think that even though the situation from Denmark is fitting for the situation in Norway, I think one thing that we have to bear in mind is that the situation hasn't been the same over the whole country. There are children in schools in municipalities who's had 2 years that has been very close to normal in Norway. And then there are many youths, primarily in upper secondary education, many of them here in Oslo, who's had very far from a normal last couple of years. So I think that the main concern that I have is that the gaps that we already know is there has been a lot bigger. And that's also the point that Marte Blikstad emphasized, that this equality that we strive for in Nordic education is maybe the one thing that has been lost. But I think another lesson is something that many has pointed to, and that is the adaptability and the creativity from both teachers, schools, and the school owners. The way that they were able to digitalize the classrooms in a very short period of time, use new tools to reach the children, both learning-wise, but also socially. And I think in many areas, we will see that we have developed the way we do education. And I think and hope that that is something that we can use also in the future. I think also that this situation has shown us that our biggest vulnerability is people, qualified people, teachers, and others working in the schools. Even though all of the Nordic countries, relatively speaking, are countries with good resources, And many of the problems in the pandemic we have solved by giving extra money to things. We've seen that it hasn't been very easy to just give more money to the schools and then sort of give them the resources to solve the problem, because there aren't enough people to do the job. And that is something that is also a problem in the normal situation, but the problem is extremely much bigger in a pandemic, where many people are home sick or in a quarantine, and where we really need the resources. And I think that is something both for planning for a normal situation in the future, but also planning for crises like this in the future. We have to see if there are other ways we can recruit people to make it possible to reach the goals that we have. And that is to make sure that children and the most vulnerable people in our society are the ones carrying the least burden when we are in a crisis like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Guri. I just want to share with you a technical sort of announcement. Those of you who want to post questions in the chat, please refresh your browser if there are any technical troubles with accessing the chat. I got a couple of comments from both Elin and Stefan, and maybe you guys attending virtually as well. You need to give me a sign, or I need some sign from the technicians here. So I saw that Stefan and both Elin would like to have a comment.
Would you like to go first?
It was when Guri Melby talked about the lack of people, because quality is dependent on qualified personnel. And in the homeschooling period, which was challenging in many ways, which we have talked about, personnel and qualification was not a problem. Because even if the teachers were sick, they actually did their job digitally anyway. But the really, really difficult period was when we in Norway and Oslo had a red level in the traffic lights model, because then you, when you normally have 30 classes, 15 classes, you had to have 30 groups and actually double the amount of staff, which is not possible when it happens in all of Oslo at the same time. So then you had the qualified person in one group, another grown-up in the other room, and the teacher had to actually manage both rooms or groups at the same time. And it's obvious that the quality of that period with teaching and education was the lowest level.
Would you like to add on?
Yes, I would, because I think some of what Guri Melby said is very interesting. And I think it's possible to look at the pandemic as sort of a magnifying glass on society. And I think it's been like that for education, the educational sector. I think the lack of teachers that we already had before the pandemic became very obvious during the pandemic. But I think her point also about, which also Blikstad Ballas mentioned, is the Nordic way of looking at education is quite different from other countries in the world. We try to combine the academic and social learning, and I would like to challenge Guri Melby on this, because sometimes some politicians have seen this as two different things. The academic learning is very important, and they think the social learning also is important. But I think one of the things that the pandemic has shown is how integrated these two are, and that you can really excel academically if you have a good social network, if you have a safety net, if you feel secure in the learning environment. And this is, I think, very important for especially the Nordic countries to learn from. I also want to say that I think it's very important that we don't try to draw lessons only on the Nordic level. I think it's very important to look at education from a contextual and cultural way. I am also on the executive board of Education International, which organizes teachers in 38 countries, I think 50 million teachers or something like that. Maybe I'm exaggerating now. I'm not sure. But EI defines quality education in terms of culture and context. That's the first thing that we, the teachers in the world, say about education. I think it's very important for us to not lose track of that. And a fear I have is that the digitalization that we've seen can push us in the direction of standardization and also commercialization of education, which I think is very dangerous, especially in a Nordic perspective, when we try to hold on to our sense of education in a Nordic model. Yeah.
Of course, you guys attending virtually, please give us a sign or, to jump in. And I would like to go back to some of the comments made, because I think all of you, and I think we all agree on the great work provided by the teachers in terms of shock digitalization, so to speak. But also I would like to go back to one of the findings from the Icelandic contribution about, how the pandemic forced the teachers to lowering the academic requirements or expectation. Any comments on that? Any from you guys in the panel? And I'll look for the virtual.
Can I address that?
For sure, Ragnar, please.
Thank you. That didn't happen by accident. We had a bit of a head start here in Iceland because we are on an island in the middle of the ocean. You all were battling with COVID before we had to. So we had a bit of time to prepare. And the preparation at first was a governmental preparation, and it was based on, I don't fear to say, a very superficial idea of education, of a very simple move from classroom to online settings, or moving some of the educational material into the national broadcasting station and such. So we were in a way heading for disaster, but we had an educational minister who did a very, very smart thing, and she called all the major stakeholders together, and they took the epidemic or pandemic on as a group. And one of the things we just decided at the beginning was that welfare was number one. Educational academic achievement was a second. And this was not by accident. This was just a very it was thought out result of what was most important. And secondly, we never had lockdowns because we never had a unified situation with COVID in Iceland. There are a lot of children in Iceland, as in Norway, who have almost been able to go to school as if COVID never happened. And then we have had some schools that have had repeat bouts of battle with COVID. And we just trusted our system to take this on, and everyone would do their best within the room of the law they could at any time. And I think this was a perfect response, and I'm very proud of both the teachers and the minister and everyone on deciding to go down this road and not. However, there was a change about a year ago or so when it started to become ever more evident that people wanted to keep the schools open no matter what. And teachers who by that time were getting tired and fatigued, they slowly began to lose belief in the government that decisions were being made on the right grounds. So, but we decided to lower academics because we have a system that is supposed to be able to meet children wherever they are, and if the system really works like that, it should be able to make up for lost time later on. That is our project now. It's not very simple, but someone mentioned earlier, I think, COVID has not just been a loss in education. It has been a social learning experiment, and we have learned quite a lot from it. A lot of children describe this as the happiest time of their lives. Many have learned independence. So I don't fear about the future if we can if we can man our system, if we have enough teachers, and this will be, I imagine, with us as with you all, tired teachers coming out of a very difficult time, with the economy going up and a lot of jobs being created again, this would be a very challenging time to keep teachers teaching.
I'll come back to this because we're going to talk a little bit about learning loss in a while. I just wanted to pinpoint to another sort of big issue, and that is action taken in the different countries when it comes to ways of measuring the quality of teaching. Were there any action taken in the different countries? It's a totally open question, so please jump in. And again, I would wait a little bit from the panelists participating virtually. Guri.
Well, I don't know if this really answers your question, but one of the discussions that we had in Norway within the Department of Education, but also with the organizations and others that we collaborated with a lot during this pandemic, was whether or not we should have very centralized guidelines for digital education, or how much presence every children should have at school, and so on and so on. And also, if there were special things in the education that the teachers should prioritize up or down, for instance. The result was that we didn't make a lot of these centralized decisions. We left it up to the schools and the school owners to make this prioritizing themselves. So all the guidelines from central government were just that, they were guidelines and not strict rules that you had to follow. And there were guidelines on how much the pupils should be in school when we had strong measures to avoid the pandemic spreading, for instance, but there weren't defined how much they should be in school, for instance. Because my fear and our fear was that if we define something, sort of a minimum level, that would also end up being the maximum level. But if we don't define it, then the schools would be more creative and do whatever they can to sort of maximize what the children got in school. And I've seen this, many people have said this. I saw that, for instance, Marta Bjermeland said that this was sort of throwing the teachers under the bus, that there was sort of their responsibility. But the goal with this was to make sure that no one got lesser education than they could have gotten if we sort of lowered the ambitions. But we were very careful also in implementing systems of tracking how many hours the children are at school and what kind of education they got, because we were afraid that creating all this big bureaucracy around them would only lead to teachers spending a lot of time on that bureaucracy instead of spending a lot of time on education and on the children. So that maybe means that we don't have all the information that would have been very nice to have now, but it meant that teachers and schools could prioritize their time on their children.
I got Elin here and Hermina from Iceland and Stefan on the list. And actually, I would also ask if Gunilla could jump in about, national actions taken. So we'll start with Hermina.
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to make one point regarding what Guri said regarding some minimal requirements and some centralized guidelines, because we saw that also in our interviews that teachers felt a bit unsecure about how far they could go. For example, some students never showed up in schools, even though schools were open maybe for 2 hours every second day or something. They simply didn't show up. and they also didn't show up on the screen when they were on Zoom. So they were a bit unsure about how far they could go. Should they just knock on the door and say, "Hey, how are you?" And so all relates to these personal issues. And they also mention it because we have education law and requirements in the country, and does that then not count in time of crisis? So all these questions I think are very important for not only teachers but also for principals. What are we supposed to do and react on when we have this crisis situation? And although we all hope that there will be no more crisis, there will be something more coming in the future. So it's interesting to discuss this. How far can we go?
Thank you. Elin?
We didn't get any guidelines nationally or from school owner, which was a mix of frustrating and a bit of a relief, because the first weeks everybody was in a kind of digital shock, and the difference between those who were kind of fluent digitally and those who almost got a panic attack by thinking that they were going to teach online. The gap was so big that all the energy went to that, and also the expectations you mentioned were kind of lowered in the beginning. But after a while, the quality, as we could monitor from our leader bench, gets higher. And then there could have been a need for digital resource and idea bank, something like that, to kind of expand the repertoire and the variation in the lessons digitally, because we didn't have enough time to practice that. Actually, 2 weeks before the pandemic schooling started, our teachers wanted to close down Teams because it was disturbing all the chatting the students did, and we were really, really happy we didn't manage to do that.
Stefan?
Yes, I would like to comment on the decision that the Minister of Education in Iceland made to put the well-being or the welfare first. I think that's a very brave decision. And we've had this discussion with the Minister of Education, Guri Melby, and the current Minister of Education, whether or not the national government should lower the demands on schools. And we have argued quite heavily for them to do that. That being said, I agree. It's also a liberating fact that they leave it up to the teachers. But it's quite a task to leave to teachers, because this is also a question of money, of resources and support. And I think a lot of teachers would find that they found that local municipalities did not give them the support that they needed. We struggled with getting enough paid overtime. It was not good a lot of places, and I think if the support had been better on that level, it would have made a huge difference for teachers. So yeah, that's it.
Gunilla, would you like to add on from the Swedish perspective?
Yeah, thank you. I think we made decisions for more flexibility, if I could say that. We gave the National Agency for Education the demand to recommendations for the local authorities and for the union and so on, for support the work for the teachers, so the working situation was acceptable, because we saw it was a tough situation when we have many schools open, but we also have many schools that had to close because of the sickness and other things. So I think we didn't give any clear demands, more recommendations during this time. and some was content and some weren't content, if I say it like that.
Thank you, Gunilla. I also know that Guri maybe want to jump in. Please do, Guri.
Yes, I just want to say that there were actually lower expectations in Norway as well. We had a temporary law that gave schools and school owners allowance to do changes to what they do normally and to not follow our regular education law. We have cancelled exams. So there has been a lowered expectation, but it hasn't been in a very explicit way. And I would have to say that one of the lessons I have learned from this is that in some areas, I think that maybe we should have had a bit clearer guidelines to make sure that there were some things that, well, maybe to take the pressure off, as many have said, both from school owners, school leaders and teachers, to sort of create that space where it is allowed to make some priorities. So I think that if we all had understood how long this was going to last, I think that we, especially from the school year that started autumn 2021, should have had some clearer guidelines to make this prioritizing easier for the schools and the school owners.
Mm-hmm. I know that Elin has a comment. I just wanted to underscore that the arguments you are providing shed light on, the sort of mixed picture of having a large degree of teacher autonomy and lack of maybe state support in a situation like this. Elin?
As Guri maybe said, the lowered expectations wasn't explicit. And the danger with that is that the decision is put on the different schools. And the differences we will see maybe in the long term. We talk with other colleagues and found out that there could be a difference within Oslo, that some schools reduced their upper secondary timetable with 5 hours a week in all the closed period and all the red level periods. And that's a lot of lessons during a year, which other schools had full timetable and normal focus.
I know that I have a lot of more questions, but we also are aware that you guys may have some questions in the chat. So yes, and Ragnar, of course. So maybe it's time to let you in to pose questions to both the presenters and the panelists. But before that, Ragnar?
Just one comment on the meaning of expectations, lower or higher expectations, because if you measure the walking speed, walking up a mountain by the same standards you measure walking speeds on perfect conditions, you haven't lowered it's not a question of lowering expectations. And we here in Iceland, and I assume in many of the other countries, we have a skill-based grading system. We expect children to accumulate certain skills over their educational period. So I would advise against speaking about lowering expectations when speaking of children adapting to learning environment and circumstances that are quite different from what they're used to.
We got a question from Karen to Anne Kortrup, and this goes back to discussion about the long-term effects of the homeschooling period and the tension between the social and the academic ambition of schooling. So she asks, Danish teachers had to teach as much as possible outdoors. How could this affect the results? And it's a direct question to Anne Kortrup, but all of you might respond to it. Anna, are you there? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, we can see, we do some correlation analysis in the data, and we can see that when they have this kind of inquiry-based teaching, there are some positive effects on the social well-being. So I think that in that regard, we did this analysis on this focus on the inquiry-based teaching because of this increased outdoor teaching, where we hypothesized that when they got out in small groups and had to be divided in small groups, got more outside, they actually were more investigative in their way of engaging with the learning material. And we actually find that there are some positive correlation with the social and emotional well-being. Not in the same way we see this positive with the academic well-being, but we see some positive effects, and I'm very keen to follow this interaction between ways of teaching in the time to come. We will continue focusing on how teaching transforms during the coming year, to see what do teachers actually take from the first period. I think we should be very much aware of not doing any conclusions on behind of the first phase, because the teachers have had more flexibility in order to not follow the curricula. And in Denmark, as you heard Pernille talking about, we cancelled all the tests, so that in some way gave the teachers a kind of freedom to do much more outdoor teaching and well-being related initiatives. So I'm very keen to follow what is actually what do teachers take with them from this period, and what is possible in the daily context when we do not have these restrictions, we do not have the long days with the same teachers in small groups and so on. So we see some indications of positive correlations between this outdoor teaching or the inquiry-based ways of teaching and the well-being dimensions, but it's too early to conclude what it means in a more long-term perspective.
Stefan has a comment, but I also would like to challenge all of you about the long-term effects. Are you worried about the long-term effects of this period, being academic as well as social? Stefan?
Yes, absolutely. But I think it's very important that we realize that we don't actually know what's been going on, and it's very early stages yet. And I hear that a lot of researchers, especially, are very interested in what we can learn from this period. Take the digitalization, or for instance, the question of outdoor teaching. I'm a bit unsure of what we can conclude from the experiences during a crisis that we can really draw on in an ordinary situation. And I think I would argue that we should be careful in doing that. A lot of teachers had no idea what they were getting themselves into when they started digital teaching. They absolutely had not done this before. And I think also a lot of parents now think that they know what teaching is like because they had the responsibility for their child at home, which is a complete illusion. It has nothing to do with what teachers do in day-to-day life. I really want to underline that, because you are not, you don't have the responsibility for a whole group of children who are not your own and who are on different, who need different things. So I am a bit concerned that everybody else is going to learn from this and tell teachers you should be doing this or that.
Actually, I think Maria Nilsbeth from Karlstad would like to give a response. Correct?
Yes, thank you. No, just a short comment to what you just said, and I have been thinking during this discussion, we haven't talked that much about digitalization that you bring up now, and we have done several studies of connected classrooms in our project, and at the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of discussions about how this time would be a catalyst of digitalization, and some talked about great experiment and so on. And I think that most researchers and in the debate can agree upon that. We can draw too much conclusions upon that, because this has been an extraordinary situation, as you say, and we more talk about this as a kind of emergency response, emergency remote teaching. But still, I think that it is of importance to see that even if many schools had a lot of access to digital tools during this period, they have implemented even more digital tools into their everyday teaching. And I have mostly been doing studies on lower secondary and upper secondary. And we see a tendency that, for instance, infrastructures like learning management systems and video conference systems and these kind of tools for remote teaching has been playing a larger part, and we will have to follow if that is something that will continue to be. And I would like to point at one issue that we think it's important to think about, is that remote teaching and digitalization doesn't only mean that students can get access to teaching from home. It also changes how schools can get access to the students' homes. They come into the students' bedrooms, they come into the kitchen, and you really don't know if you have distance teaching online, who is participating? Are the student's parents, siblings, friends, and so on. So it really raises new questions about integrity for both teachers and students, I think, that we can see in our studies and that we would like to point at as an important issue when we try to draw conclusions about digitalization and teaching for especially the basic schools, where, as for instance, Marte mentioned, the Nordic model relies on an idea of providing physical meeting places for children from different backgrounds. And I think that it's important, and we think it's important to see that the importance of having this physical room and not give too high hopes on digital solutions in the future.
Stefan would like to give a comment back, I think, and then I have Elin and Guri and Gunilla on the list.
I share your reflections on this, and I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't learn from the digitalization that we've been through. And I think if we use these tools in the social context that learning is, we can really excel. But I want to point out one fact. In the proposal for a new law of education in Norway, some politicians seem to leave the door wide open for digital teaching on for many kids. There's almost no barriers in the proposal for the new law. And that law is presented at the same time as the same politicians are really concerned because a lot of kids have now only had digital learning. This is, I find it mind-blowing that we, at the same time as we conclude that this has not been a good enough education during the pandemic, we propose that we should do more of this. I find it very hard to believe.
So, provocative argument, good. Elin?
That first, I agree very much. It's not totally black and white, because for some pupils or students, it has been a good period because they could hide, they could easily take contact with the teacher without others watching, and some have had increased focus on schoolwork because they are not distracted by everything else in the classroom as they normally are. But the main conclusion is that teaching and school is best when everybody's present and you have the interaction. And according to long-term effects, I agree, it's too early to say, but we can already see at the school the student research that's made every year, Elevundersøkelsen, that you can see a fall in the motivation. There is a lack of motivation, which is worrying because it hasn't been high earlier either. And they also say that they are looking more forward to go to school, but they are less interested in the subjects and in the educational path, which is worrying. And when it comes to the teachers, you have this crisis year where everybody had to feel the fear of getting ill, being infected, the effects on the family and all that. but they were there, and there was an expectation that the teachers had to be there at any time, 24/7. And now, when it's safe and everything is back to normal, now I can see the tiredness, the flatness, the lack of motivation. They are still positive and giving everything and say, now we could have normal school, but now we can see the signs, and I'm worried that this will increase and that it also will affect the recruitment of new teachers.
For sure. So we are close to sort of wrapping up this discussion. So we have Gunilla and Guri, and I will also ask Ragnar to give a comment on the long-term effects before I close down this session. Guri?
Thank you. Well, maybe I'm just being very optimistic here, but I think that, well, as I said earlier, my biggest fear is that the gaps between students are getting bigger, that the ones who were already struggling in the normal school after 2 years of pandemic, 2 years of limited education, their gaps will be even bigger, and that it will be difficult for us to help those pupils enough in order to close that gap. But we should really try. So I think that should be the focus now. What can we do now when the school is getting back to normal to give more students, more children, well, extra backing in order to close that gap as much as we can? I think that will be very important. And I think that one positive thing, Stefan said he was worried that everyone thought it's so easy to to teach a child. Well, I think that in society as a whole, I think that the awareness of how important school is for our entire society, for our children's well-being, I think that awareness has become much larger after this couple of years of pandemic. And that can be something that is positive. It can mean that we prioritize spending more resources on school and on education. It can mean also that it is attractive for young people to work there. But we have to do something in order to transform that into something positive. It doesn't come by itself. But I think definitely that there is a foundation there, and if we use it well, it can mean something positive for schools and for education, and therefore for children and young people in these countries in the future.
Thank you. We have a few comments from Gunilla and Ragnar, but please make it short.
Yes, I would like to say something about the long-term effects. I think if we don't succeed to get support to those who need the most support, as for an example, the Swedish for immigrants in Sweden. Then we have a loss of people who don't succeed. I think so. More strength and more help to these, I think, and more study time, perhaps for some of them. But I think also a long-term effect, a positive long-term effect, is the understanding among people about the importance of school and teaching. I think it has increased during this time. And I also think that people see that it's in the meeting that the learning happens.
Thank you. Ragnar, have you a short comment or?
Yes. I think that I'm quite worried about the long-term effects. If you're a 17-year-old student in Iceland, you started going to preschool in economic crisis. You have been you've gone through the last 2 years without social life. you're disillusioned with the adults. They don't know what they're doing about the environment, and you read the news about people on the brink of World War III. So I think the long-term effects we can interpret it both ways. I think our Nordic countries haven't been as kid-friendly places to grow up the last 10 or 15 years as they used to be, and this adds on to that. And we have to make great changes in making children optimistic again, and give them good grounding in going into the society as a whole.
Thank you, Ragnar. And with this argument from you, I will go back to Monica and leave the last part for her.
Unfortunately, we are nearing the end. It has been a delight to organize this valuable discussion with friends from all over Norden. Hopefully, I'm not the only one who has learned a thing or two about what challenges Nordic schools are up against at this extraordinary moment in history. Before we turn off the screens here at the House of Literature, on behalf of QUINT, I want to thank you all for engaging today. School leaders and researchers, school politicians, key stakeholders, our online audience. As this seminar has demonstrated, there is still much to unpack, so let's keep the conversation going. Eig thee godt kveld. Ha en fin kveld.